Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are once again venturing into the depths of the woods. So I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlight and let the darkness take control. This happened to my father-in-law 10 years ago at our hunting camp in Alabama. It popped into my head as we were heading there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting, and he told me to go ahead and share his story. As some people probably know, we get out an hour or so before light and climb into a tree stand, a ladder leading up to a seat in a tree, usually fairly deep in the woods to hunt. This foggy morning, my father-in-law had been in his stand for a few hours, and it was getting light, and he was reading a book as he waited for something to happen. Out of the fog, he hears a woman's voice, much closer than anyone should have been to him at the time. She's calling, "Hunter, oh Hunter," very sing-songy, like a mother calling her child in for dinner as he played outside. Now, as I said, he is pretty deep in the woods, and there are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket getting to your stand, which is why we go out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him camouflaged in a tree, she must have seen his light when he walked out, followed him into the woods, and waited hours before calling him. His first thought was that maybe the woman was calling someone called Hunter, perhaps her son. She called again, "Hunter, oh Hunter," and he realized that he is the hunter. So he turns around, peers around the trees, and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and halting speech, explains that something is wrong with her hot water heater and asks if he can come and have a look. Now, the strangeness of the situation hadn't set in yet, and he's a give the shirt off his back kind of guy. Not to mention he's 6'2", nearing 300 pounds and has a gun, so he wasn't too worried about this small woman, and starts getting down the tree to go have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting land, probably a 10-minute walk away. She walks inside and leaves the door open. He's trailing behind a little, so he gets to the door, kind of knocks, and sticks his head in and says hello. Where he entered is a laundry room, and he can see there in the room is a hot water heater, and water is just pouring out the valve at the bottom, just absolutely pouring onto the floor. He walks over, turns the valve off, sticks his head in the house to say hello, and nothing. No one answers. The house seemed empty. Empty of people anyway, but it was a disaster inside. At this point, he's starting to see how strange it all is, and decides that this is just the sort of situation that could get you robbed or worse, and nopes the hell out of there and hurried back to our cabin. Now, we have hunted in this land for years since, and have never seen anyone at this place, although until this season it has shown obvious signs of being lived in. So every time I pass by her place, which backs up right to the road we take to our hunting stands, I think lady in the trailer with the messed up plumbing, who may or may not have had nefarious intentions for my father-in-law, please, let's never meet. I am an 18-year-old male from Namibia, Africa. I experienced this in 2016, along with my older sister and girlfriend. It happened during the school holidays as we took a trip to my grandparents' farm. It was one of the places that we loved going to. One morning after having breakfast, my father informed my sister and I to go make a stop at another farmer's farm. He told us that we were to deliver a few farm tools to him that my granddad had supposedly borrowed. My sister perked up when she heard that we would take the car, since the farm was a few kilometers away. My sister and I decided to let my girlfriend tag along, since she still didn't know my family very well. As we were driving along the gravel road, we joked, talked about small things and other crazy stuff until we reached a road that had trees on either side of it. The trees grew in such a way that they blocked the sun's rays from reaching the gravel road, so we were basically driving under a large shade. I want to let all of you know that I'm very familiar with this part of the road, and I've driven through it many times before, and nothing strange has ever happened. But on this peculiar day, something was off. The birds that usually sang were quiet. Even the wind seemed to be silenced as we drove. By now, we were all quiet and just listening to the gravel beneath the tires of the car. We passed a large tree that had a white mark on its bark, and I dismissed it as I have seen it many times before, and after a few moments I realized that something wasn't right. I checked the time on the radio and it read 2:07. My eyes immediately went wide. We left our farm at 12:30. It never took us long to reach our neighbor. I was a little confused by this. Then my girlfriend said something from the back seat that confused me even more. "Guys, didn't we pass this tree 5 minutes ago?" I looked up, just in time to see us passing the same large tree with the same white mark on its bark. I knew something wasn't right, and I immediately looked at my sister, and she had a frown on her face that I couldn't exactly interpret. "What the hell?" I said out loud. We drove a little more, and we passed the same tree every time, until my sister got angry, and we came to a stop just a few feet away from the same tree. We got out, and were met with a deafening silence. My girlfriend got spooked, got closer to me, and I put an arm around her. "Okay, what the hell is going on around here?" my sister said. "I don't know. We should have been at the guy's farm by now." "We drove past this tree 20 times, my girlfriend said. "I'm no stranger to the paranormal. I've had weird experiences before, but nothing ever like this." I was incredibly freaked out, to say the least. As we got into the car again, we saw a red pickup truck drive slowly past us. My sister immediately started the car and closely followed the pickup truck. We drove through the wooded area just a few feet behind it, and after moments, we realized that the environment started to change. I sighed in relief as I saw the dam that was on the right side of the road. We were all glad we got out of there safely. I don't know if this was a loop or a glitch, but it was definitely paranormal. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I know what I experienced that day. We all did. We got home safely without any incident, but we never told our family or anyone else what happened. We have all heard stories of the area of the road being haunted, but I never believed them. After experiencing this, however, I can safely say that my point of view on the matter has changed. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friend and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be very rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area, and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time, and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving home until the sun was up. One particular night, we decided to ride a few miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favorite hidden routes. It began with a narrow paved path that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and extremely relaxing to ride through due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off the path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill, overlooking where we had just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers ride up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers and 2 on fully sized motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. We felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculate who these people could be. Our first thought was they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times we'd been through, and honestly we doubted that this county had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out there. We can see you. Come out." We stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell, "Find them now," and smash a bottle. That had erased any hopes we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and paths. One of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but was too afraid to open my phone in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their furthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and fast as we could through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we could hide again whenever we felt that they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us while basically only being covered in leaves and plants may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the woods onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we had started. We ducked down into the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor, who was supposed to meet up with us after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the two streets we were near the corner of, and explained that we needed to be picked up right away. He agreed, and sped over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seats of his car, yelling for him to get the hell out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I felt being safely driven home after everything I had experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out there, and that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law and taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think we walked right up to a huge drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started and we couldn't see it, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. We'll never really know, I suppose. I have been mountain biking since I was 11. It was the only thing that I thought would make me stand out from the crowd, and I was hooked. I moved to a smaller city when I was 15, which was surrounded by mountains and countless wild trails to explore. So I was thrilled when I finally found a riding buddy willing to take the risks. We went out riding all the time. He was born there, so he knew a lot of trails and was very familiar with the suburbs. We lived in a very religious community. Traditions oblige that in a certain month, we have to abstain from eating and drinking anything from sunrise to sunset. Our cycling hobby was no excuse to this tradition. During this month, we limited ourselves to a 30-kilometer ride every 2 days, in order not to cause ourselves physical harm or injury. As we were approaching the city limits returning from a ride, my friend urged me to check out this new trail he had discovered, and despite the exhaustion and dehydration, I obliged. We took a right turn into some woods. The trail was amazing, smooth dirt path, beautiful scenery, and occasional jumps. We were absolutely carried away, until the trail disappeared into fresh agricultural soil that was impossible to ride on. We hopped off the bikes to go back to our trail on foot, and as we walked back, I started to think this was a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't have gone too deep into the woods. We were in full mountain bike gear, flashy stuff, and easily noticeable from a distance. My friend was very calm though. We found our trail, and the second I lifted my leg to hop on my bike, some dude grabs my shoulder. 3 guys with dirty clothes, scarred faces, and reeked of BO and cow shit. "What are you doing here?" the older guy starts. I was too scared to speak, and my friend handles these kind of situations better, so he did the talking. They started asking us all kind of questions about our bikes and gear, till one of them laid a hand on my friend's bike and dragging it from him. I remember his exact words. "I'm sorry, but we're taking the bikes." Before we protested, he adds, "Are you fasting today or not?" I answered that we were. "Well, we're not. And if you weren't fasting, we would have taken the bikes and slashed you guys up before sunset." They said it in such a cool and strange tone, and topped it off with, "Stay safe out there." I was in awe. My friend told me he was about to pull out his knife when the guy grabbed his bike. I can only imagine what would have happened. I moved out of that city, picked up motorcycles, and we still ride together and joke about the encounter. I'm grateful it only turned out as badly as it did. I've had a lot of strange jobs, but one of the most interesting was working for a tax company based out of Texas. I lived in Kentucky, my home state at the time, but because this company contracted out jobs remotely, I was able to make a very good living for performing tasks which were generally very simple. I had a work partner, and our duty was to travel all over the eastern and central part of the state to county courthouse PVA offices. You might not have those, it's a small town thing, and research delinquent property taxes. We were then required to compile a list of properties who had delinquent taxes and submit it to our boss. She was our primary contact in Texas. This part is important because it was the only reason we would sometimes have to deal with hostile people. The company would then buy the taxes if the property tickled their fancy, and a letter was issued to the owner of the property, stating they had a certain amount of time to repay the amount. I'm not sure what would happen after that, since that isn't part of my job. But I do know that people immediately assumed, because of lack of knowledge or understanding of the law, this company was going to take their property and throw them out on the street. Before the company bought the taxes, however, they would send us back a list of the ones they were interested in, and we would then go out to the location, photograph the property, and then submit all the photos to our Texas contact. This is where things got interesting. It was like the property owners had some kind of psychic intuition about us. They had no idea who we were or when we were coming, since we worked almost always on our own. And they didn't know what kind of color car we would be in. Yet somehow they would frequently burst out their front doors as we pulled up to take pictures of their location. This made for some interesting and often frightening confrontations. After getting comfortable with the job, I even came up with a convincing story to tell angry property owners when they chased us down with their car. We're from the Country Property Valuation Administration. We're just updating our property files and need a current photo. This would de-escalate the situation, and they'd apologize for threatening our lives and sometimes running us off the road to make us pull over. I had a lot of stories from this job, but here's the best one. We were deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky one day, searching desperately for a single wide trailer from our list. We found a holler matching our direction. This is way before the GPS days, and we had to use real country maps and took a chance. As we drove up the holler, houses began to spread out further and further, and soon we were totally isolated. Nothing but trees and a narrow gravel road. Suddenly we spotted the trailer. It didn't look anything like it did in the PVA picture. Time had really taken a toll on this place. Some of you might not understand this depending on where you're from, but around my home state, one grows very accustomed to the look and feel of a potential location for drug manufacturing. I know that might not make sense, but trust me, we knew immediately that this place was a prime location for a meth lab. We didn't spot the trailer until we had driven a little ways past it, so we didn't get a great photo on the way in. As usual, we decided to drive on by, turn around, and get the shot on the way back. Apparently someone saw us on the way in. This was a very rural road, and not even a road at this point, since it had turned to gravel a mile or two back. I basically had to turn the car by pulling up onto an embankment and doing what felt like a 32-point turn to keep from going off into a ditch. While I was turning, my buddy said, "Hey, look." I looked, and 3 people were walking out of the woods into the road. Just people, no big deal. I had the car straightened out on the road at this point, and noticed they had weapons. A young, nasty-looking fellow was holding a baseball bat of all things. A nasty-looking older fellow had a shovel. Both were shirtless. And then there was a screaming girl. Something clicked in my head. On the drive-in, when my partner snapped the photo, I heard a girl scream. It was an angry scream, but I couldn't make out what she said. I didn't even know where it came from, and I certainly didn't think the scream was directed at us. Apparently it was. These people were now walking with intention towards my car. I kept thinking, is this really happening? And what exactly is happening? My partner was freaking out a little, and convinced they were going to attack us. It's hard to explain what was going on through my head at this point, because I couldn't really believe what I was seeing. The only thing I could think of was, hit 'em with the car, just like on Grand Theft Auto, otherwise you're gonna die. They were screaming, shaking their weapons and closing in, and I was running out of time. I revved the tiny engine in my red Pontiac Grand Prix, hoping to scare them, and then I let off the gas. I plowed towards them with the fury of all 6 cylinders, or 4, however many there were, and they jumped out of the way at the last minute, as I grazed by them, throwing gravel and dirt into the air. Once we were at a safe distance, I slowed down and looked back. Luckily, they were gone. Unluckily, we were once again too far from the trailer to get a good shot. I explained this to my boss when I emailed her my day's recollection of property photos, and she seemed to understand. After that, I kept a loaded .45 in my glove box and felt significantly more confident while doing my job. I quit a couple of years later though. It was just too dangerous, even if I was packing heat. So to the hillbilly meth-making counterparts of Otis, Baby, and Captain Spaulding, let's not meet again. There is a man-made reservoir located approximately 3 miles from my home, which spans generously over 650 acres of preserved state land. Along with boating, kayaking, and fishing, a lot of people use the reservoir to walk, as the massive lake is surrounded by at least 5 combined miles of hiking trails. Since moving to the area in 2004, I have spent a lot of time at that reservoir, which I never believed to be haunted, until I had an experience there I will never forget. It was late fall, so most of the leaves had already fallen off the trees, making it easier to see squirrels scampering away from the sound of my footsteps, or birds flittering from branch to branch hundreds of feet from the trail. At this point, I had been walking for about 45 minutes, so I was pretty far back into the woods and hadn't seen another person the entire time. On this particular trail, there is a landmark of sorts, a bench, that I use to determine how far I've walked, and I usually turn back when I reach it. Just before the bench, there is a narrow fishing trail that leads to the reservoir's banks. As I crossed the fishing trail, I noticed the sudden appearance of an older man with shoulder-length white hair, wearing a straw fishing hat, suspenders, and blue jeans. He was carrying a rusty metal bucket in one hand and a dog's leash in the other. I searched the spot that his gaze was fixated upon, the ground at the end of the leash. There was no dog to be found anywhere near the man, and the clip at the end of the leash was lying motionless in the dirt. Surprised yet not quite startled, I said to the man, "Hello." His eyes turned towards me, but he said nothing. This was concerning to me because he seemed old enough to be my grandfather, and he was all alone in the woods. "Are you all right?" I asked the man, stepping towards him. Again he said nothing, and did not move but continued to look me in the eye. I decided not to pester the man any more. Surely, if he was in some kind of trouble, he would tell someone. I stumbled along in semi-confusion towards the bench, the man now gone from my peripherals. When I reached the bench, I took a few minutes to stretch and take a swig of water, hoping that in that time the man would have crossed the trail and disappeared into the forest. Much to my surprise, as I approached the fishing trail once again, I still saw the man and his eyes were once again cast down to the end of the leash. I kept my eyes from making contact with him this time, directing my focus on the fallen leaves and snarling branches in front of me. As I crossed the fishing trail once again, I could feel the man's eyes turn towards me, but I did not return his gaze. Instead, I waited until I had crossed the path and could look at him from a distance through the mostly barren trees. Underneath the brim of the man's straw hat was a grey complexion, contrasted by glowing yellow eyes looking straight into my soul. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and it suddenly felt as if all my breath had been stolen away by the wind. I stared back for a moment, and then instinct took over, turning my crunching steps into panicked strides. Every few seconds I glanced back at the yellow eyes, hoping I'd imagined them, to no avail. They remained present, until I had gotten far enough away, and the density of the trees obscured them completely. What the hell was that? All I could think of was that question while I slammed my feet along the trail. I racked my brains for any and all logical explanations for what I had just seen, and came up with one that made some kind of sense. This man, definitely not a ghost but a man, had probably been fishing at the bottom of the trail and got tired on the way up, explaining his need to take a break. He probably isn't much of a people person and didn't want to have a meaningless conversation with me. I get it. As for his eyes glowing yellow, maybe the sun was catching them in a certain way. The more I reasoned, the more confused I became, and could no longer remember how long I had been running. As I rounded a corner, I almost ran into another hiker, and nearly jumped out of my skin at the sight of her. "Hi," the hiker said cheerily as she passed. I returned her greeting, then turned toward her and said, "Wait, this is going to sound insane, but I don't think you should walk down there." She froze, now noticing my bewildered expression, and said, "What happened?" I breathed deeply and spoke my truth about what I saw to this stranger, fearing that I would sound absolutely bonkers. Surprisingly enough, she believed my story, but found no reason to believe that the man I had seen was something paranormal. Instead, we walked together to the end of the trail and used an emergency phone to contact the reservoir's ranger on staff, to whom we told about a man in the woods possibly needing medical assistance. We followed the ranger to the spot that I had seen the man, and told him that I would rather not go with him. The other hiker and I waited for the ranger to return, and when he did, he looked disappointed and irritated. "There was no one there, miss," the ranger said with exhaustion. "Well, I'm sorry to bother you. It just seemed like he needed help. He really didn't look well," I retorted. The ranger left, and the hiker and I made small talk for a few minutes before I said, "Do you think it's possible what I saw wasn't human? Confusion swept over her face for a moment, before she realized what I meant and then said, "You definitely looked like you saw a ghost when you passed me on the trail." It's been years since these events transpired, yet I still find myself peering down the same fishing trail each time I pass it, expecting those yellow eyes and that twisted grey expression. I have never had another paranormal experience at this location, though I have sensed the presence of others many times while hiking here. This happened 2 years ago in Oregon. It was my birthday in April. We took a trip deep woods hiking and camping, as that was my favorite thing to do. I also remember this incident well, as this was a time when my wisdom tooth was flaring up and I was in pain. Not excruciating, but certainly annoying. We had spent the day driving around the woods and hiking when nightfall had started to set in. It had rained all day, sometimes hard and other times barely a mist. But as the sun started to set, you could tell there was a nasty spring storm rolling in. We drove up a remote forest road that hadn't been maintained in what seemed like years. The trees had grown into the road and scraped against the vehicle, but we liked camping off the beaten path to avoid humans. We had come to an area where the road widened on the top of the butte and was surrounded by second-growth forest and some scattered old-growth trees. We stopped the car and prepared the car for sleeping. I don't sleep in a tent anymore. I flat out refuse. We had sat in the car listening to the wind pick up, and it was going to be a nasty storm. The trees were rocking, and it was a bit unnerving. Being on a high point on the terrain made the wind a bit worse. We had the windows down, as there was more wind, and the rain was only a drizzle. That night wasn't particularly cold, so it was comfortable to have the windows down. That's when I started to hear the noises. Every so often I'd hear what sounded like two men talking off in the woods. You can hear it more clearly from my side of the car, when the wind calmed down in between gusts. You could kind of hear it when the wind picked up, though, more drowned out. I could tell whatever it was making these sounds was off at a distance. You couldn't make out anything they were saying. It sounded like they were having a very continuous conversation, though, as there were never any breaks in the noise. My roommate was talking, and I asked him to stop for a moment and listen. He then heard the voices and didn't know what to make of it. Then things got ugly. At least my fear level shot to that point. We started to hear what sounded like a baby crying off in the distance on my roommate's side of the car. That for some reason made me absolutely nauseous. It's the middle of nowhere, pitch black outside, and all these noises are not your typical crickets and are louder than the winds of the storm. As these noises seemed to get closer, we decided we'd had enough and drove in the direction of leaving this forest road. When we got to about 2 miles down the road, it intersected with a more maintained forest road, and we stopped there to organize all the stuff, as we had gotten comfortable, leaving blankets on us and food out. As we sat there organizing the stuff, we heard the sound of people talking at a distance. Then they stopped altogether. We sat there in silence for 15 minutes, and you could hear something running down the road from behind the car. It ran right up to the car faster than anything I'd ever seen. It's like it floated, and this huge black mass comes right up to the driver's side window. That's when my roommate floored it, and we took off. I couldn't see any details of this creature, as it was pitch black outside, but it was extremely large and dark. The mass was like an upright cow running up to your car. We ended up getting to the main highway and drove another half hour down the ridge and camped elsewhere. By then we were exhausted. Nothing happened at the new location, but I was on edge. It was a birthday I'll never forget. I still deep wilderness hike, but with protection, and even then I still feel intimidated at times. As you're walking, you seem to feel fine, but when you stop for a break, you catch that feeling sometimes, like something is staring daggers through you from the tree line. I grew up in upstate New York, not like Rochester, New York, but backwoods of the Finger Lakes, New York. I lived in a smaller city, but my best friend and his somewhat well-off family lived in a very secluded area a good many miles outside of town. His family owned a huge plot of land, and his neighbors had also given his family permission to roam their land, adding up to hundreds of acres. We had been close since elementary school, and had an interesting dynamic. He loved coming to my house to be in town around people, and I loved going to his place to escape the woods and enjoy nature. Around the time we turned 14, we started to explore deeper into the forest than before. Somewhat due to our interest in exploration, but mostly due to his family not wanting us to go too deep into the woods for fear of getting lost or running across the bears that lived nearby. After a few hikes, maybe a mile or so up the hill, we discovered a vast network of old logging trails and abandoned campsites full of junk. Most of the junk that was distinguishable was made of glass, bottles of all sizes and colors, and an assortment of old power insulators from power lines long since decayed. We guessed from 1930s, but what does a 14-year-old know about dating such things? One day, about a year later, we decided to explore deeper. An important fact of the situation is his father had spent a great deal of time teaching us firearm safety. This was for many reasons, but a running rule was not to venture into the woods without a firearm to scare off the bears or deal with situations that could arise. This has never been an issue, and certainly felt like a good rule. We packed snacks, water, some super basic camping supplies, and 2 rifles. We set off to venture as far into the trails as we could, with enough time to return before dark. We started up the trails we were used to and found an old path that seemed to be a bit more dense in vegetation and had a small stream running alongside it. We followed it and found 4 more campsites with all the same junk piles as the others, except one which has a wooden shed that was mostly collapsed with some cans and rusted tools inside. Nothing very special, but an exciting discovery for a 15-year-old kid. We proceeded another mile or so, and we noticed a dark silhouette about 1/4 mile down the trail. Clearly a large structure, but definitely not a house or shed. As we got closer there, we clearly saw the rectangular wooden structure. It was in good condition despite clearly being very old. A single door on the end of the short side was closed, as were the 6 windows along the long side, leading towards the stream that ran to the right of the trail. There was rotting wood along the stream edge, which we figured was once a water wheel to power whatever this building once did. As we approached the door, we readied the flashlight we had, but something strange happened. It might have been our nerves in the moment, of course, but the normal sounds of the wood dimmed. No leaves shaking, no animals scurrying, nothing. Even the stream seemed silent. The sort of silence which makes your skin crawl. The sort of silence where you can seem to hear your own blood flow. We opened the door and turned on the flashlight. It was very dark inside, as the wooden shutters kept the light out quite well, with small slivers of light peeking between the various boards making up the structure. The room was small and mostly empty. On the left, a small workbench stood with a rusty saw blade and some rusted chains on it. Otherwise, only some nails sticking out of the wall broke up the room. We walked towards the door across the room and opened it, with the trail of light from the front door following us, as we had no intention on closing it. We stepped into the next room, and immediately suffered a series of shivers and goosebumps, but neither of us wanted to seem scared to the other, so we continued looking around. We scanned the room, which was a bit more exciting than the last two. Larger windows on each side, and yet another door opposite us, with many more rusted items around. As we looked over the various rusted items, we slowly walked deeper into the room, and we approached the center of the room as it grew darker. Suddenly, the front door shut. We both jumped and looked back, shining the flashlight, but nothing was there, except the door with its faint bands of light shining through its old boards. We caught our breath and decided it must have been the wind, and pressed on. We approached the door, and it was certainly noticeable we both wanted to get out of here due to the unease of the air inside. We entered the last room, and it was the same as the first, except there was a larger table instead of a bench along the wall. Nothing sat on it, but a hammer lied on the floor at its base. The hammer seemed newer than the previous items, but we would not have time to inspect it, as we jumped in terror when the first door to the prior room slammed shut. This was clearly not the wind, and both of us immediately panicked. We drew our rifles and yelled as we slowly backed towards the door in the room we had not opened yet. We noticed the light through its boards as we entered the room, so we assumed it was the exit, and now it was the only option we felt we had. We yelled again this time, forming words instead of the frightened yell we had before. "Is someone there?" But nothing. We opened the door behind us, watching into the dark room we had been in previously, and stepped out into the silent woods. We looked around and saw no one, which was almost more unsettling than it would have been had there actually been someone. We started walking down the trail towards his home, using the stream as a navigation marker. As we started to lose sight of the structure, we thought we saw something outside the door that we had exited. We were startled, but we were almost certain it wasn't there before. A shadow that resembled the outline of an average height person. We pressed on another half-mile or so and started to hear twigs and sticks breaking a good ways behind us. We turned around and looked, but saw no movement. Instead, a shadow almost silhouetting a person stood by a tree about 500 yards from us. "Hello? Why are you following us? We're armed." But again, no response. No movement, not a noise. It just existed there next to the tree. We started to run down the trail, and about a mile further along we turned back, and it was there again, over some bushes, about the same distance back it stood. We really felt the terror overtake us, and we started yelling, "Stop following us! You're trespassing, we have guns!" But nothing. It just loomed in the woods, and we couldn't help but feel a piercing stare. We continued to run, and once we neared his house, we turned back again in a fairly large clearing, only a mere 1/3 of a mile from his house or so. But again there it was in the tree line at the end of the clearing. We yelled, "Go away! You're trespassing, we're gonna fire at you!" Childish, but we felt cornered at this point. So my friend fired a warning shot towards it, hoping it would run, or at least flinch. Instead, it almost felt like the world stopped for a moment. Everything felt strange in a way I could best compare to the feeling you have after waking up from the strangest falling dream. It did not move. This was such an unexpected reaction that we turned and ran to his house as fast as we could. Once inside, we hid in his basement playing video games and attempting to pretend like none of it had happened. Many years later, we rounded up a group of friends and hopped on an ATV to return to the structure. We rode the entire length of the stream and found many campsites, but never again did we find that building. It simply was not where it should have been. I don't know how to explain this story, but I know it's kept me up many a night. Has anyone else had this sort of thing happen? Or perhaps an explanation? This happened to me when I was in grade 6, 10 years ago, around September. At recess and lunch, we went outside on nice days. The schoolyard consisted of 2 playgrounds, a soccer field, and a baseball field surrounded by a wooded area. We were not supposed to go into the woods, but there were a few monitors out keeping an eye on 100 or so kids. On this particular day, my friend Courtney was in the woods and came running back, telling me and my other friend Justin to follow her in. A couple of meters in, there sat a tent and a middle-aged man sitting nearby. We're a little freaked out, but the guy immediately explained to us that he was homeless and hungry. Us, thinking we were clever, asked to see his ID to know if we could trust him. I remember his first name was Justin, the same as my friend, and after this we left with the impression that homeless Justin was a nice guy. So the next day we decided to pack some extra snacks for recess to give to homeless Justin. For the next 3 days we brought homeless Justin food and had brief visits with him. We tried to keep him a secret for the other kids, but being so young, we weren't so good at hiding that we were sneaking into the woods each recess. On the last day I saw Justin, he told us that these woods weren't big enough and asked if there were any bigger woods around the area for him to live in. Wanting to help, I explained that there were in fact deep woods near my house, a 5-minute walk away. After school, Courtney and I walked him there, as Courtney lived up at the top of the hill, closer to the woods. So when I got to my house, I left to go home, and for Courtney to bring him up to the top where the path to the woods began. Now this man never actively tried to hurt myself or my friends, but Courtney came and told me the next day at school that the police had found them at the top of the hill and arrested homeless Justin. Courtney and I still aren't sure how they found out what was happening and where they were going. And the next day at school, the principal came into our class extremely angry that we had been foolish enough to help a random dude living in the woods. But our young minds couldn't wrap our head around why. So we decided to Google Justin's name. Turns out local news had published that he had murdered his girlfriend and son and was on the run from police. So random guy living in the woods behind my elementary school, let's not meet again. Living in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, I've seen and heard tons of weird stuff. One time, I was walking down the road and found a coyote skull, with the eyes still intact, sitting in the road. It had mostly been stripped by birds at this point, but I'll never forget the eyes. It was April, and my best guess was that it got trapped in the snow that winter, died, and as soon as it started melting, other animals decapitated it and left it in the road. Now, I've had some stuff happen to me that I can't explain. I was walking on a seldom used abandoned settlement trail in the early spring, when the least amount of hikers around. I was 17 at the time. As I headed up the trail, I could hear a distinct humming in the woods, a little bit away from me. It sounded like a woman, but no one should have been out there at the time. It's a trail that's rarely ever used in the summertime, when people are out and about in the woods. It also, at first, seemed far enough away that whoever it was couldn't see me, making the chances of it being someone messing with me almost zero. For a while I kept walking, telling myself it was something natural, like a stream of water running against the snow and rocks. But every time I stopped, it stopped too. When I would continue on, it would get louder. I got a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and turned on my heel back the way I came towards my car. I think I was probably a half-mile in at this point, and something in my brain told me to run, and I took off, even though the snow was pretty difficult to move quickly through. I swear something was running along beside me in the woods, keeping pace, but I was too afraid to even glance at the tree line. I got into my car as quickly as possible and stared back at the trail. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was watching me, and I got out of there fast. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's video, don't forget to leave a like and drop a comment with what you thought of it. If you have had any creepy or unexplainable experiences within or outside the deep woods, be sure to drop me an email or send the story to my Reddit. All information can be found in the description. A huge thank you as always to my incredible patrons for their help and support. If you'd like to get some awesome perks, then feel free to check out my Patreon. Link also in the description. But with that being said, it's time to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.